Welcome guys, we're going to talk about what we talked about today in Social Studies 20. And so it's just a quick review as always. Please make sure you go over your notes for a lot more detail. And so today we talked about the outcome of World War I, or the war to end all wars. And so the reason why World War I was known as the war to end all wars was essentially because the unparalleled damage that we saw as a result of the war. So we have mass production of more dangerous weapons than ever before. So we see essentially machine guns being used at a much more rapid pace than ever before up until this point. We see warships, bigger and more powerful warships. We see tanks being pioneered, the use of airplanes as part of air forces, as well as chemical weapons. And so the reason it's called the war to end all wars is because the damage was much larger than had ever been done up until that point in history. We saw that as a result of the conflict, both sides spent incredible amounts of money and there was mass casualties. And so one of the reasons why World War I was so long was it was a war of attrition. So each side was trying to grind the other side down. And so this is largely because of trench warfare. And so with trench warfare, each side is dug in and they fight over pieces of land that they slowly try to take hold of. Those pieces of land are called no man's land. And so trench warfare is one of the reasons why the conflict lasts so long and is largely one of the reasons why the Schlieffen Plan fails. We saw that the war has got an impact on Canadian identity in predominantly two big ways. Number one, conscription or compulsory military service divides the country, because what starts to happen is that Francophones do not feel a connection or an affinity for the British government, and they feel like, why are we fighting in Britain's wars? However, Anglophones don't feel that same conflict, and so conscription splits the country because you have French speakers who don't feel a connection to Europe's conflict. However, English speakers feel that connection back to Britain. And so some of the major battles the Canadians are involved in are Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge. And so one of the interesting things about these conflicts is that by Canada performing these heroic actions and Canada doing these amazing things in the war, what it does is it creates a sense of unity within the country and essentially a sense of nationalism. So we see that it makes people feel like they have achieved something great together. And so we talked about World War I coming to an end, and so we saw that some of the causes of World War I were militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. However, the same way national interests lead to the war, national interests actually lead to the end of the war. So for example, Italy switches sides because it's not in their interest to be part of the Central Powers because they're not promised the land that they are given. Russia has a revolution, so their interest is to deal with domestic issues rather than European conflicts. The United States initially stays out of the conflict because they're isolationist. However, when they feel threatened by Germany's alliance with Mexico, as well as the bombing of ships that carry Americans, it's now in their national interest to get involved. And so what we see is nations engaging and disengaging with the conflict as long as it's part of their own national interest. So the same way national interest leads to conflict, nations pursuing their national interest lead to the end of the war, because for some countries it was not beneficial to get involved in the war anymore, and other countries it was beneficial for them to get involved in the war. And so what brings the war to an end? Essentially, those same factors that we talked about begin to reverse. So we start to see alliances break down. We see empires fall apart, such as the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the the German Empire, and the Russian Empire. The armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918, Remembrance Day, which essentially brings an end to hostilities and an end to fighting, and the actual war ends in 1919 at the Paris Peace Treaty. And so at the Paris Peace Treaty, this is where we stopped off. The US President Woodrow Wilson lays out his 14 points for lasting peace. And the reason why Woodrow Wilson lays out these points is because peace is in the American interest. Because if there's peace, America's trading partners, they prosper, and American lives are spared. And so some of the points of the 14 points was open peace treaties to avoid the secret agreements that play a role in World War I. He wants to disarm, so essentially step back on militarism. He wants freedom of the seas to make sure that American vessels and Americans are safe while traveling on the waters. encourage international trade because it's in America's interest to have trade partners, and it's harder to fight against trade partners. And to build boundaries based on self-determination, because essentially people fighting for self-determination led to the conflict, led to World War I. And finally, the creation of a League of Nations, which essentially is what comes before the United Nations. That's where we stopped off today. Tomorrow we're going to continue talking about the League of Nations' success and failures. I'll see you guys tomorrow.